I didn't want to do this because I felt like, we had already reached a stopping point, but I actually have to continue because I didn't ever actually explain how God formed. I did explain how God transformed himself into existence by receding from himself. And this should be oh shit, I didn't think about that. I just now realized, okay, now how God created everything is God receded from himself. God detached from perfection. God knew himself. In the act of knowing, one must detach. In the act of examining, one must detach from the thing that they're examining. If I'm going to examine a microbe in my microscope, then I must detach from the microbe. I must even detach from my own eyeball and see through the microscope's eyeball in order to see the microbe. And so, and I've always thought this was interesting, the tree of life is separated from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The tree of knowledge of good and evil does not bring you life. In fact, it's the opposite of life. Why? Because every time you live, you don't know, you believe. You don't know what time it is when you're absorbed in the moment. You don't know that you're acting like a dumbass when you're falling in love. You don't know. You aren't there. You don't have the self-consciousness that you had. You fall into the moment. Like a dog or a cat or an animal, where you just don't have any self-reflectivity. You aren't self-conscious, so you're free to be whoever it is that you are. Animals don't get embarrassed. Animals don't feel shame. Animals only understand reward and punishment. They're very simple. You give them something good, they're going to try to get that good thing. You give them something bad, they're going to try to avoid that bad thing. And that's it. And they don't care about, well, the other animals are talking shit. I don't want to deal with them talking shit, so I'm not going to do this. You'll see dogs that will roll over and show their stomach to the alpha male in a scene of subservience that you would never see in humanity. A human would never do that. A human would never take a knife and put it in their opponent's hand and then take their opponent's hand and put it to their own throat and then kiss their opponent and say, I love you, you're so great, please don't kill me, but you can, here you go, if you want to kill me. We don't do that. We do it metaphorically, but we don't physically enact it. I mean, an animal will physically enact this shit, okay? They'll eat their own shit. They'll eat their own vomit. They'll do all kinds of weird-ass shit that a human would balk at and be like, what the fuck are you doing? So humans experience self-consciousness in a way that animals just don't. They don't do that. They don't get embarrassed. They don't feel regret. They just deal with the shit that's in front of them in the moment. And that's why we love them, is because they get us to reset in the present moment. They don't worry about the past or the future. They're just there for the moment. And they love the present moment. They're perfectly fine with living in the present moment. And that makes us fine with living in the present moment, where we don't have to worry about the past or the future. And that's why we love animals and why we love to keep them around us as pets. They're a great center. They're a great foundation because they don't have any of that self-consciousness that gets in the way of our being, who we are. And so, how does God get born? Well, because nothing was nothing. And when it was versus when it was not is a huge, vast chasm that I call the limit of the 0th iteration. It's a limit in between iteration and uniteration. And what is it to iterate? It is to pervade all relativities. There are no more relations that could be considered or applied to or dealt with or interacted with that have not been. And when that happens, then there is a happening. There's an iterating. There's a being in the verbal sense. So when nothing happened, the happening of nothingness, the iterating of nothing, iterated according to the static establishment of limits. When uniterated nothing pervaded throughout all existence, as soon as uniterated nothing became limitless, it established the limit of limitlessness. It established the fact that it existed. It established the nature of the nothing. And so the iterating is an act of defining. It's an act of, and definition is an act of separating what is from what is not. And that's what a definition does. Everything that it defines is in it, and everything that is excluded from what it defines is outside of it. And there's a stark line in between what is and what is not. And that's why we call objects discrete. And we say that we can discern them and we name them and all of that stuff. And their names are in accordance with their definitions. And then their definitions are in accordance with whoever is defining its line in between what it discerns to be what it is versus what it is not. Now, when we strip away the measurer and we say not even God, but just things the way that they already are, at the point of nothing, before God, before the beginning, before everything, before timelessness, before anything that we could ever possibly imagine, there was nothing. Now, at this point of nothing, as soon as this nothing established its limits, then it became the nothing. It became something that happened. It became the 0th moment, as I call it. Now, there's a reason that I call it that. I don't call it the first moment. I call it the 0th moment. Because it didn't happen, and yet it did. Just like 0. It's a number, but yet it has no value. But yet it has a value, but it doesn't have a value. It's like the value of valuelessness. It kind of borrows from above. what it is beneath. So 0, in a way, is very much like nothing. It's the mathematical representation of nothing. So if you were to try to figure out what nothing is, then you can play with 0 and you can start to see what nothing is by how it interacts relatively mathematically with other numbers. And so, for example, you get the positive numbers as proximal locations relative to 0, with 0 being the center and 1 being the shortest discernible distance between 0 and not 0. So 1 is one discernible unit away from 0. It's the limit of discernibility. The number 1 defines the limit of discernibility. Whatever it is that you say that you are discerning, that's what you have 1 of as each individual. So you can say 1 cow. Well, what is that? Well, as soon as you define what a individual cow is, then you count 1 of those as an individual who is a cow. So as soon as you define what a cow is, then you define what the number 1 is, because you define what it is to be a cow, and then you exclude everything that is not a cow, and then you understand what it is to be 1 cow. It's the number 1 relative to being a cow, or being a cat, or being a human, or being an apple, or being whatever it is. And that's how you end up with those delineations. And then when you combine all of those, like Bertrand Russell attempted to do, and say that the number 1 is actually a collection of all of these examples of singularities, of saying that it's an individual, which is to say that it is a whole unit. That definition goes beyond what Bertrand Russell's was, which is to say that it is a simple class which references itself in some abstract way that we never define. I say the number 1 is a whole unit which has been minimized to the point of not having an environment, whose environment is nothing, and not having any part which is not of itself, but which does have parts, which are all the fractions in between 0 and 1. And I could get into some mathematics about what is 0 divided by 0, what is 1 divided by 1, what is infinity divided by infinity. And then the number that you say that ends in the conclusion of that determines where you are, whether you're in, at, or on the thing that you're measuring. So if you say 0 divided by 0 equals 0, you're in 0. If you say 0 divided by 0 equals 1, you're at 0. If you're saying 0 divided by 0 equals infinity, then you're on 0. And that just depends on which 0 you place above the other 0. Or if you place them equally across each other, then you get 1. If you place the first 0 as lower, you get 0. If you place the first 0 as higher, you get infinity. And, it just depends on how you relate the zeros back to each other when you say 0 divided by 0. Now, all that being said, like I said, 0 is the mathematical, which is a finite way of describing things, way of describing nothing. It is not the full description of what nothing is, because it's mathematical. It deals only with relativities and deductible logic, of course, because that's what math is. It's logic reduced to simple deducibility, pure absolute deducibility. Whereas, for example, art is subjective and science is objective, which is the application of math to some specific object, which requires objectivity to define what an object is. Mathematics is transcendent and above that. In relativity, there are no objects, there's just relations. And so math is only describing a relation between two things. It doesn't care what those things are, it cares about what the relation is between them, the ratio of influence and the interaction between these two, whatever they are, things is. And so that's what math describes as the relation between two unknown, indiscernible things. So when it describes nothing, it describes as zero. Because zero is the center, and then you've got infinity at the periphery, etc., etc. And I could go on and on. But anyway, the point of all this is about how God emerged from nothing. So you've got nothing, uniterated nothing. Now, it pervades a totality of some kind. Even though it's uniterated, it pervades throughout that uniterated space, does it not? It pervades throughout all of it because it's intolerant of anything else, and because we're before anything else, before there's any causation, before there's anything to be there, there must only be nothing. So we go backwards enough times, we roll the clocks backwards enough times, we get to zero. T0, what happened at T0? What happened at the zeroth moment? Well, what happened at the zeroth moment is something that should be a no-duh moment. It's when nothing committed the act of being. It became a thing. Now, at the first moment, that's when the paradox actually actualizes. That's when nothing is nothing. Before the first moment, nothing is nothing. It doesn't have an is. Nothing is not. Excuse me. Before the first moment, at the zeroth moment, nothing is not. At the first moment, nothing is nothing. That's a paradox. So the first moment is a paradox, but the zeroth moment is not a paradox, actually. Nothing is not. That's not a paradox. You can have that forever. Nothing is not. And this is what I was saying about God. God was able to exist for a timeless epoch. We'll get to that. All right. So there was nothing. That doesn't mean that nothing is. It just means that there is not anything. Okay? So that's where we start from. There is not anything. It's not that there is nothing. It's that there is not anything. So when there is not anything, that's uniterated nothing. Now, that pervades throughout all existence because there is not anything anywhere. So that means that there is nothing everywhere. That's the consequence. That's the implication. That's the aftermath of there not being anything. The aftermath of there not being anything is that there is nothing. So the consequence of there not being anything is that there is nothing. Now that's really just a fancy way of showing you what happens when you take deductive logic as a field and you put it in nothing. Well, then you only have the deductive field. Now, this is what's so interesting about this, is the field of deductive logic, being that it is fully consistent, logically valid, means that it proves itself within itself. If I assume that deductive logic is real, then I apply it to an environment of nothing and it survives it. It survives it because of its own internal integration and thus its resistance to the external environment of nothing. That's what makes deductive logic stand out. That's what makes deductive logic a field unto itself. Objectively, physically, that's another field. Relatively, theoretically, this is the logical field. And subjectively, artistically, there's yet another field. But that has more to do with God than I know about. And I don't know how to go over there. That's Christ's business. But for relativity, oh yeah, I can show you some relativity. So why is there a God? Well, because if you take the deductive system, logical system, with you on your journey to nothing, and you arrive at nothing, and you're smuggling in, you're carrying with you this deductive system. Yeah, you can derive the deductive system from the deductive system because it does not require any external cause or creator. It doesn't require anything to sustain it outside of itself because its parts are fully integrated with each other. They don't have any gaps and they don't have any contradictions. And because of that, it's fully crystalline. And so then the field of logic emerges from itself there. But, like I said, it's smuggled in. Now, what if you don't smuggle it in? So here's where some interesting things happen. If you say that deductive logic is just another system inside of all these other systems and it's just a part of whatever, then you can ask, well, what is this whatever thing that it's a part of? And you can smuggle that in. Or you can say, I don't want to smuggle anything in. I'm just going to sit with nothing. Well, if you sit with nothing, then it'll just sit there and be nothing. So, this is where things get interesting. If you want anything to continue, you have to bring something else into there. If you just sit with nothing and you don't even bring deductive logic into it and you don't bring any relativity into it and you just allow nothing to remain subjectively nothing and you remove your own subject, well, then you aren't there to be able to ask the question, what happens to nothing? In a subjective field where there is no logic and no deducibility and thus no iteration. What happens in uniterated nothing before it iterates is a question that removes itself. You cannot ask that question and yet receive an answer. You can ask it, but you won't ever get an answer. And you can answer it, but you won't ever have a chance to question. So you can't ask and then receive an answer. There's not enough room for that. There's not enough room for relativism. There's not enough room for relation. There's not enough room for extension. In subjectivity, with no relativity, with no logical field, if you were to apply only the subjective field to nothing, then the only thing that you receive back is a conception of nothing, so that the nothing gets conceptualized into a subject to be named, to be talked about, to be related to later on, but you name it nonetheless. So how do you come about that naming process? How do you come about conceptualizing nothing? Just so we can remove any smuggling in of anything else and yet still observe this nothing. So if you were to remove your own subject, but then also abstractly recognize that the nothing is removed of all subjects, it cannot be subjectified. And if I do subjectify it, if I do conceptualize and name and reify and point at and refer to nothing, That is not nothing. That is a referent. It might be a referent of nothing, but it is a referent nonetheless, which is completely different from making no referent. So here's where we get to the nothing. As close as we can get to it is to say, there is no referent. Or as I like to say, there are no words. There is no more room for words. There is no more room for concepts. There is no more room for discernibility. The nothing pervades all. Now, given the fact that nothing must pervade all, then we must call all a thing. And that is what we reify when we quote-unquote reify nothing. And that is what we name when we quote-unquote name nothing the nothing. That's what we're naming. We're naming the subjectification, the conceptualization, the limits of our own consciousness as it approaches the nothing. But then, if all of our conceptions point at the same location, can we not then say that that location exists? And that's where I say, you have this faith, because you can't observe it, because there's nothing there to observe, that there is this thing called the nothing, and then you ascribe to it all these godlike properties of being able to emerge out of nowhere and nothing and be timeless and have no cause and yet still exist and still influence everything else around it and yet not be influenced by anything else around it and be pure of itself, in and of itself, all the time, every time. And it's absolute, and there's no way of ever confusing it with anything else, and it's perfect in every way that you could ever measure. It's a God. And you turn the nothing into a God, and then you find this thing because you've subjectified it, you've deified it. Because you've named it, you've destroyed it. It's not there because you've named something. That thing isn't nothing. You can't even say it's a part of nothing because nothing has no parts. It has no whole and it has no parts. And it is not there. And if you say it is there, then you say that there's a God before God. Now, you can say that, like I said. All the things that I just described can be done. You can do it. And that's what lucidity does. It says that there is such a thing as the nothing. And that when I'm pointing at it with my conceptions and my names and my natures and all the things that I ascribe to it, that there's something there that's being referenced. And that as long, before I reference it, it is a referent. And before it's a referent, it is itself. And that there is a self that is before the referent. That is when I make my root. And it is so fundamental and it is so deep. Now, what happens when I do that is I make the referent the reference frame. I say that they're identical, that they're the same thing, because nothing is the referent and nothing is the reference frame, because there is no referent and there is no reference frame. And because there is no referent and there is no reference frame, then nothing becomes the referent and nothing becomes the reference frame, as a consequence of there not being a reference and a reference frame. As soon as there is no referent and there is no reference frame, as soon as that's the case, then it is equivalent, logically speaking, that nothing is the referent and nothing is the reference frame. At which point, I have broken the first commandment. Now, what does that mean? As, like I said, the totality emerges, where you say, there is nothing, then wherever and whenever that is the case, constitutes a referent, and therefore constitutes a reference frame, which surrounds that referent, such that the referent is included and everything that is not the referent is excluded, and that line is the reference frame, and that line is indiscernibility, and that which is beyond that indiscernibility is being, which is me, which is looking into this void before God, finding nothing as the referent, being indiscernibility as the reference frame. And therein lies the paradox, and that's how you end up destroying the whole thing. Because you can't have something that is the referent and the reference frame and nothing all at the same time. Because nothing is not a referent and is not a reference frame because it's nothing. So, you commit some kind of a paradox when you do this. Now, that is the ultimate root of faithlessness, because it's like I say, it's a conviction that's so strong it becomes, it's a doubt that becomes so strong that it becomes a conviction unto itself. Now, that isn't saying nothing. And that isn't not saying anything, because they're two different things. When you make nothing a referent or a reference frame, you're already committing a paradox from which any conclusion can be drawn. Because nothing is not a referent. It's nothing. It can't be a referent because it's nothing. It can't be a reference frame because it's nothing. So the only way to deal with it is to say that there is no reference frame and there is no referent. And so because there is no referent and there is no reference frame, I can then put that fact, that there is no referent and there is no reference frame, as my referent and reference frame. And that happens, and then you get indiscernibility. And then that becomes a thing, because then the referent being nothing and the reference frame being nothing are two completely different things trying to occupy the same place at the same time. The referent is trying to become the reference frame. Now, when that happens, you get an infinite feedback loop. And it's the same effect as if you were to take a camera on your computer, right? If you've got a webcam on your computer and you spin it around and you put it right back at the laptop screen or the monitor screen, you get an infinite feedback loop. That's indiscernibility. That's what happens when you introduce a referent and a reference frame, but yet that's all there is just the referent and the reference frame. Well, then the referent is the reference frame, and the reference frame is the referent. The camera is the thing that's watching, and the camera is the thing that's being watched. And so you end up with this infinite feedback loop, and that's indiscernibility. And that happens automatically because of nothing pervading all of whatever it is that you want to call that uniterated space. Because there isn't anything in that uniterated space, then the uniterated space becomes homogeneous and then becomes a static object. It's a total system arrangement. Even a vacuum is a total system arrangement. It might be an arrangement of no things, but that's an arrangement. That's a frame of reference. That's a clip in the movie. It's a frame in the movie. It's there. It's like a photograph. And like a photograph in a dark room where you can't see who's shooting the photograph and you can't see what's being shot, then you've still got the same exact problem there as the infinite feedback loop. It's the same problem, but from a different angle. So you've got an infinite feedback loop at indiscernibility. You've got absolute black nothingness at nothing. And so you end up with problem where if there is uniterated nothing, then necessarily that uniterated nothing must occupy some limited space, because there is such a thing as iterated nothing. Or there is no limit to uniterated nothing, and then therefore uniterated nothing then has that limit of limitlessness. It is defined as that which has no definition. It is defined as that which has no limit. It is limited by no limits. It is defined by no definition. It is what it is not. It is nothing. And so that paradoxically creates indiscernibility. It's what creates the infinite feedback loop. It's what creates the spontaneous movement from nothing, uniterated nothing, to iterated nothing. And that happens simply because of the fact that nothing is so pure. If there was anything else in it, then we'd be able to say that there's some doubt in there. There's some indiscernibility in there. We can't really tell that that's one discrete object. But because we know that there cannot be anything inside of nothingness, then we know that all there is nothingness, and then therefore all of that nothingness is one thing, because it's all one thing. There is no room for anything else, because there can only be nothing. And so there must be only nothing if there is nothing. And the onlyness of that is what makes nothing iterate. The fact that there can't be anything else except nothing is what makes nothing iterate, because it's pure, because it's necessary, because there can't be anything else except it. And so then it manifests and it becomes real, because there can't be anything else but it. And that's what makes it become real. And that's the paradox of nothing being nothing. And that's the natural consequence of nothing. And that's why there is not nothing. Now, you take that all into account and you say, yeah, okay, that makes sense to me. You're going to hell. Because you put your soul, which is not nothing, in this root of nothing. You cannot place any gods before God. If you put nothing as a thing, you're done. You're fucked. So then, because there was not anything there to iterate, there cannot have been an iteration. That's the correct answer. And it's weird because it's not exactly logical. But after you really survey the whole thing from like if you take the lucid view of there was this nothing, and because there was this nothing, it made this paradox of there only being this one total system arrangement, which is the definition of an object. An object is a total system arrangement. It's a total system arrangement of nothing. And because there was nothing, there must have been this total system arrangement. That idea is insane. There was not anything. So then it wasn't there. You know the time that never happened? You know the space that never was? You know that thing that isn't there? It's not there. There is no such thing. It never happened. It was not a happening. It did not happen. It isn't happening now. It's not a thing. It's not thing. It's nothing. Not thing. Nothing. It didn't happen. It wasn't there. And so we can skip right past it, and we can assert and believe and have faith in God as being the primordial, timeless being which created everything thereafter. Therein lies the distinction between those who will go to hell versus those who will go to heaven. And then, like I said, you could just throw your hands up in the air like you just don't care, and then you won't care, and then you'll have a dreamless sleep with the demiurge halfway in between, and then discernibility. You could do that too. It's all up to you. It's all a choice.